Good day, everyone. This is Mark Vello, and you're listening to Headline News. Biden administration will fight the unfair trade practices of the Chinese Communist Party. On Monday, March the 1st, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative released the Biden administration's first trade policy agenda and annual report, saying it will use all available tools to combat unfair trade practices by China. The report notes that the Biden administration recognizes that China's coercive and unfair trade practices hurt American workers and businesses, threaten U.S. technological edge, weaken U.S. supply chain resilience, and undermine U.S. national interests, including theft of intellectual property, forced technology transfers, and industrial subsidies. Therefore, the U.S. Trade Office needs to have a comprehensive, systematic, and strategic approach and use all available tools to address the CCP challenge. Under the Trump administration, the United States has taken an unprecedentedly tough stance on the trade practices of the Chinese Communist Party. The two sides negotiated the first phase of a trade agreement that requires China to increase its purchases of U.S. goods and services by $200 billion over 2 years and to remove some market barriers. At the same time, on top of the ban on imports of forced labor products, the Trump administration had introduced sanctions under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. But 1 year since the trade agreement was signed, China has not met its promised procurement targets, in part because of the corona/CCP virus outbreak that has affected the economy. The Biden administration therefore needs to decide whether to retain the tariffs imposed on some $370 billion in Chinese goods to pressure Beijing to comply with the terms of the agreement. The Biden administration is currently conducting a comprehensive review of U.S. trade policy toward China. Biden's nominee for U.S. Trade Representative, Katherine Tai, said at her Senate confirmation hearing last week that she will continue to pursue former President Trump's Phase 1 trade deal and facilitate China's delivery on its commitments. She argued that tariffs are a very important part of a fair trade remedy tool. In addition, the U.S. will explore a wide range of options to address China's intellectual property theft and market access restrictions that prevent U.S. companies from competing in the Chinese market. She also noted that the U.S. needs to have a strategic and coherent trade policy with China. In addition to addressing the trade challenges of the CCP, the Biden administration has stated that combating the corona/CCP virus epidemic and ensuring economic recovery are priorities for the administration. The Biden administration will ensure the nation is better prepared for future public health crises by increasing domestic investment and strengthening the manufacturing supply chain. It also said the United States will work closely with allies to restore Washington's global leadership in addressing labor issues, climate change, and unfair trade practices. The report specifically mentions that the Biden administration will make it a priority to address the issue of forced labor by the Chinese Communist government against the Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang, noting that Americans and consumers around the world do not want products made with forced labor on store shelves. And the workers should not be disadvantaged by competing with a state-sponsored regime of systematic repression. The U.S. Congress requires the U.S. Trade Representative to submit the President's trade policy agenda and annual report detailing his trade policy by March the 1st of each year. Canadian lawmakers submit petition to Congress demanding punishment of top Falun Gong persecutors. Recently, Canadian MPs James Bezan and Marty Morantz have petitioned in parliamentary debates, asking the Canadian government to sanction Chinese Communist Party officials who persecute Falun Gong, and saying that it is time to identify and punish these people. Between August and September 2020, Canadian Falun Gong practitioners launched an online petition signature campaign calling on the Canadian government to sanction CCP officials who persecute Falun Gong, the Epoch Times reported on March the 2nd. In October of the same year, Canadian Falun Gong practitioners continued to launch nationwide signature collection campaigns in their parliamentary constituencies, calling on the Canadian government to use the Canadian version of the Magnitsky Act, which are the Judicial Corruption and Bribery of Foreign Officials Act and the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, to sanction Chinese Communist Party officials who persecute Falun Gong practitioners and commit serious human rights violations. The newspaper said that the petition has continued to get the attention of a number of cross-party federal MPs from British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and other provinces. They have submitted petitions signed by residents of their constituencies to Parliament. On January 26, a petition with 30,000 Canadian signatures was delivered to Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and members of Parliament, demanding sanctions against 14 CCP officials, including Jiang Zemin, Luo Gan, Liu Jing, Zhou Yongkang, and Bo Xilai, for their brutal persecution of Falun Gong and serious human rights violations. On February 17th, James Bazan, Conservative MP from Winnipeg, Manitoba, presented a petition at a parliamentary debate stating, "It is about time that we use the Magnitsky Act to target, name, shame, and make sure these Chinese officials are not using Canada as a safe haven for travel, and their investments are not bringing their families to Canada. Given that they are carrying out these horrific acts against peaceful practitioners of Falun Gong." On February 26, Canadian MP Marty Morantz, speaking in a parliamentary debate, also said, "For over 21 years, the Chinese Communist regime's corrupt officials have orchestrated the torture and killing of many who practice Falun Gong, a spiritual discipline promoting the principles of truth, compassion, and tolerance, and harvest their organs for the regime's organ transplant trade," Morantz added. The petitioners call on the Government of Canada to deploy all legal actions, including freezing assets and barring entry to Canada against the 14 individuals identified by name in this petition and any others committing these acts. In response, two foreign ministers, François-Philippe Champagne and Rob Oliphant, responded to the petition in writing, stating that the promotion and protection of human rights is an integral part of Canada's foreign policy and a priority in the Canadian government's dealings with the Chinese Communist Party. Canada has consistently called on the CCP to respect, protect, and promote freedom of expression, assembly, and association, as well as freedom of religion and belief. In response to the intimidation and repression of ethnic and religious minority groups and Falun Gong practitioners, Canada has publicly expressed concern and will continue to do so at every appropriate opportunity. U.S. Secretary of State condemns the arrest of 47 pro-democracy activists by the Hong Kong government. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and White House officials condemn the Hong Kong government's subversion charges directed at 47 pro-democracy activists and call on their immediate release. "We condemn the detention of and charges filed against pro-democratic candidates in Hong Kong's elections and call for their immediate release," tweeted Blinken on Sunday, February 28th. "Political participation and freedom of expression should not be crimes. The U.S. stands with the people of Hong Kong. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also retweeted Blinken's earlier January tweet that Beijing's arrests of pro-democracy activists are an assault on those bravely advocating for universal rights, and that the U.S. government will stand with the people of Hong Kong and against Beijing's crackdown on democracy. Early on Sunday, Chinese Communist authorities accused 47 Hong Kong democracy activists of plotting subversion, saying they were suspected of participating in an illegal election last year. On Monday, March the 1st, nearly 1,000 Hong Kong citizens gathered outside the West Kowloon Magistrates Court to show solidarity with those arrested. Later in the day, in an interview with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Blinken was asked what the United States could do to reprimand the Chinese Communist Party for its human rights violations. Well, I think there are a few things, he replied. First of all, it is really important to speak up, to speak out, and to do so with other countries who share our abhorrence at what is happening to Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or, for that matter, what's happening to democracy in Hong Kong, said Blinken. But in terms of practical measures, I think there are a number of things that can be done. For example, countries should not be supplying any products or technology that can be used for repression of people in China, for example, the Uyghurs. Similarly, countries should look at making sure they're not importing products that are made with forced labor. Those are very practical things that countries can do and focus on to make sure not only is our voice loud, but our actions are too. He also reiterated his belief that the Chinese Communist Party's approach to Uyghur Muslims is genocide. Previously, Blinken's predecessor, Mike Pompeo, shortly before leaving office, released a statement that the CCP's treatment of Uyghurs is genocide. This statement has sparked public concern and is currently being reviewed by the Biden administration. This concludes today's broadcast. Thank you for your time, and stay tuned for the next headline news.